And welcome to the Miller Center. We're a academic unit at the University of Virginia that brings together practitioners and scholars from schools from across UVA, as well as practitioner fellows who have served in the federal government and beyond, to talk about issues of pressing national importance. And there is not an issue of greater national importance right now than the wars in Ukraine and the war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. We're really fortunate to have an extraordinary group of scholars and practitioners assembled this morning to talk about it. And some of that comes out of a year and a half of activity since February 24th, 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine. We've pulled together a great group of scholars who discuss not just the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, but the international economic dimensions and the geopolitical dimensions stretching to East Asia. October 7th, 2023, when Hamas brutally attacked Israel and Israeli civilians, as well as military installations, opened a second front in global conflict. US planners have for many years wondered about and planned for and tried to prepare for two fronts in global conflict. But now that we have two fronts in global conflict, where we have partners and friends and allies either involved in the conflict or immediately threatened by it, the potential for opening a third front suddenly challenges the United States in important ways. Almost 2 weeks ago tonight, President Biden spoke from the Oval Office about the importance of supporting both Israel and Ukraine in this conflict. And we'll talk about that today as well, including the domestic dimensions. What I'll do, rather than introducing all of our panelists, is as I call on them, I'll give you quick bios. Their longer bios are available on the Miller website in the link for this event. But I'm first going to call on perhaps the newest member of our group, Mara Rudman, who is a Schlesinger Distinguished Professor here at the Miller Center. She comes to us having served in the federal government, including as Deputy National Security Advisor at the White House and a Deputy U.S. Representative in the Israeli-Palestine negotiations. Mara, tell us how we should be thinking about this. How do the two wars connect? What's actually happening on the ground between Israel and Hamas in Gaza? And from your perspective, how does it connect out?
Thanks, Bill. Appreciate it, and appreciate joining this group for this important discussion. I want to start where you referenced in terms of President Biden's speech of, I guess now a couple of weeks ago, because I always start with what U.S. national security interests are at stake, since that's the primary responsibility of any president of the United States and of U.S. policymakers looking at U.S. national security interests. And I thought President Biden did a good job in that talk of laying out some of the why is this the United States' fight? Why are both of these the United States fight in terms of being active supporters of both Ukraine and Israel? So borrowing liberally from the president's comments, he talked about terrorists and dictators, the danger when they don't pay a price for their terror and their aggression. It causes more chaos, more death, more destruction, and that increases the costs and threats to the United States as well as to the world. The president talked about Putin, for example, not stopping at Ukraine if he's allowed to proceed undeterred and claim the Ukrainian territory, dismantle the Ukrainian state, that Poland will be next, the Baltics, all NATO allies and American troops will be fighting in and against Russia as soon as the NATO border is bridged, and so supporting Ukraine, helping Ukraine defend itself is a way of turning that back. And beyond Europe, adversaries and competitors are watching. The president noted this. If the U.S. walks away and Putin erases Ukrainian independence and emboldens others, and risks of conflict and chaos spread, That is also true in the conflict with Israel, in Israel's actions now with respect to Hamas, and being able to reduce the ability of Hamas's military leadership, militant leadership, terrorist leadership, to attack again in the way that they did on October 7th, to threaten the very existence of the state of Israel. So again, there are not exact parallels. Hamas is not Putin. Hamas is a terrorist entity, not a state. We can separately discuss what kind of state Russia is at this point, but I would say certainly an authoritarian state. But in both cases, the kinds of actions that they've perpetrated need to be deterred, and the United States has a key role in needing to do that. Beyond that, Iran is supporting Russia and Ukraine. We know that. Iran is supporting Hamas and other terrorists in the Middle East. China is playing an interesting role at this point, certainly largely behind the scenes. I would say not entirely so. But this is a global conflict. So, Bill, yes, these are two fronts. We also know at the same time that for the United States, China is what we call our pacing competitor. But these are all intertwined in some ways. Yes, these are individual conflicts with individual sets of actors and issues involved, and we need to understand those dynamics. At the same time, we need to be able to see how and where they interconnect. I say we as the United States, because U.S. leadership and alliances are part of what keep America and Americans safe. And those are part of exactly what don't allow us to walk away from either of these conflicts at this point in time, in my view. And also, they both, another kind of similar tie between them, both Hamas's attack on October 7th, Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February of last year, are both attacks on sovereign democratic states. And I say that with full appreciation of issues in Ukraine's democracy, and very real and very recent, and I would say still ongoing challenges within Israel's democracy, which I'm more than ready to discuss in further conversation. But however fragile and whatever issues both of those democracies have, what Hamas did was to absolutely, and in the most brutal and horrific way, to threaten the very existence of Israel with its attacks, and Putin and Russia, same with Ukraine. One thing I want to, before I pass it back over to you, Bill, and to Steve and to Eric, who will add immeasurably, I'm sure, to what I've laid out here, I want to take just a moment on what I feel like has gotten very confused in the public discourse, which is the importance of operating within the laws of armed conflict, which apply in both places. And I actually went back last night in preparation. Slides are for those who are operating for military, all military who are operating in these kinds of conflicts. And yes, operating within the laws of armed conflict does mean protecting civilians in combat to the fullest extent possible. It means limiting violence to what is necessary to achieve the military aim, and to make sure that you're doing so in a way that's intended to reduce as much as possible suffering, loss, and damage that will be caused by war, and is not designed to impede military efficiency in any way. So those are difficult and competing concepts to hold at the same time, but they are ingrained in the laws of armed conflict. So when military objectives are attacked, you want to make sure, if you're following the laws of armed conflict, that civilians and civilian objects are spared from incidental collateral damage to the maximum extent possible. And this kind of damage should not be excessive in relation to the direct and concrete military objective you anticipate from your operation. So would love to, if we have the opportunity, unpack that a little bit more, because I think that we are all understandably moved and concerned whenever you see innocent civilians who have died or are suffering the effects of conflict, and particularly so in the current age where we're seeing it in real time on our screens or in our social media traffic. But at the same time, I think keeping the balance in mind of legitimate military objectives and the means to reach them, and how you maximally protect civilians, but that doesn't mean unfortunately, does not mean no civilian loss of life. So with that, Bill, let me turn it back to you.
Well, thank you, Mara. That was a really terrific overview. I'm going to call now on Steve Mull. Steve is the Vice Provost for Global Affairs here at UVA. He's also a Miller Center practitioner fellow, and his practitioner accomplishments include having been ambassador to Poland, right next door to Ukraine, and certainly important in the Russia conflict, as well as having worked on the implementation of the Iran nuclear agreement. So, Steve, from those two perspectives, and then also from the perspective of a senior leader here at UVA who has been watching the rising student protests, as it were, on both sides of this conflict, please share with us your take on this two-front global crisis.
Thank you very much, Bill, and good morning to everybody watching. And it's great to be with so many esteemed friends and colleagues from over the years here at UVA. Just as after the war broke out, after Russia's repeat invasion of Ukraine back in February of 22, these horrible incidents, the Hamas attack on Israeli civilians on October 7th, has prompted a lot of really interesting and useful analysis about why this has happened now and why it seems so much worse than ever before in the long-running saga of Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Various reasons that people have talked about include lack of progress on a two-state solution, which the US had been pursuing, sometimes more enthusiastically than others over the past 20 years. Certainly, Iran's support for Hamas, Hezbollah, and other proxies in the region, and using those proxies to destabilize and endanger Israeli and American interests in the region. Internally in Israel, its lack of preparedness for this attack has been actually shocking to many people who follow these things. Israeli internal political divisions, no doubt, contributed to a sense of weakness that encouraged Hamas that they could be successful in this. And then the continuing violence on the West Bank, the settler violence against Palestinian communities, sometimes aided by Israeli security forces. There's probably something to all of these factors in explaining why this conflict has happened now and with what severity. But regardless of how valid any of these are as explanations, none of them can possibly justify or explain away the utter depravity of the attacks that we saw against those poor Israeli civilians on October the 7th. And yet, one of the most shocking reports I've seen in recent weeks, just this week, as a matter of fact, was in a survey of American attitudes towards events in the Middle East. A shocking 51% of 18 to 24-year-old Americans, the very demographic that we need to be concerned with most here at the University of Virginia, 51% of that group believe that the Hamas attacks could be justified because of lack of progress on creating a state for the Palestinians. Now, as shocking as that is, I'm pretty sure that those numbers are probably a lot higher around the world, particularly in the global South, where we so often turn for support in advancing important US foreign policy issues, whether it's defending Ukraine, confronting terrorism, competing with China to create a more liberal world order. And so if we're looking at those kind of numbers, I think we need to start asking ourselves questions why that is and what we can do to correct it. Because until we can get more people saying that when you go in and kill babies in their cribs, that's morally reprehensible and that can never be justified. And as we make progress on changing that narrative, I think we'll be more successful in uniting the world and maintaining political support for what conflict, for whatever we're pursuing, whether it's in defending Ukraine, defending Israel's right to exist, and other important interests around the world. One of the most important ways to do that is to come up with a strategy to pursue the principles that are important to our interests more clearly and more consistently. One of my old bosses, Secretary Madeleine Albright, used to be fond of saying, there's no such thing as a cookie cutter foreign policy. Foreign policy has to be developed in response, as Mara said, in defense of US interests, in response to differing situations around the world. That's true, and as any diplomatic practitioner knows, you can't apply the same policy to every situation around the world. And yet, our strong, full-throated support for Ukrainian sovereignty, and especially in recent years, our less than active support to create a two-state solution for the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, I think has laid bare an inconsistency that makes it very difficult for us to make progress in pursuing our interests in both of these cases and in others as well. So I think, and I'm not naive, if we had been very active and successful in making progress for a two-state solution to address Palestinian aspirations for statehood, I have no doubt that there would still be violent extremists actively trying to take that down, egged on by Iran, has been happening, and so we're always going to have the Hamases of the world that we need to respond to strongly, swiftly, and decisively with as many allies as we can. It's just that if we make more progress and have a higher profile in addressing those aspirations in a constructive way, we'll have an easier time in getting support from the rest of the world, and frankly from our own domestic electorate in pursuing those. I think there'll be plenty of time to retrospectives and lots of hindsight 2020 kind of operations. Was it a wise move to pursue the Abraham Accords so enthusiastically? Yes, we should have been pursuing it, but should have we paid more attention to the Palestinian part of the puzzle as we work to support these dramatic breakthroughs with UAE, Morocco, Bahrain, and hopefully one day Saudi Arabia? Was it wise to move the US Embassy to Jerusalem in spite of the rest of the world not really going along with us? Was it wise to recognize the annexation of the Golan Heights? Was it wise to remain silent in the increasing settlement of the West Bank? So there'll be plenty of time for historians and political scientists to analyze those questions. But in this crisis, I hope we will seize an opportunity, because it is an opportunity, to take another look about how we're going to use our national power, prestige, and influence to make more progress towards solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in a way that will lead to the creation of a Palestinian state that's secure while making sure Israel remains secure, and getting as much of the world to go along with us as possible to make that happen. Thanks.
Thank you, Steve. Really helpful framing. And Eric, in some ways, a great tee up for a topic or a set of topics that you've been so eloquent about, which is somewhere between supporting our allies and restraining them, and how far we should go in either of those directions. In both conflicts, I think it's fair to say that the headline has been a headline that the White House has been trying to engineer is unconditional support, and yet the subheading is, if not the conditions of that support, the restraint around that support. So tell us a little bit about that, including how those two, how perhaps that mixed message plays across the two conflicts.
Bill, well, thank you. I guess since the World Series wrapped up last night, and congratulations to all Texas Ranger fans who celebrate, it's appropriate that I should be batting cleanup. Um, and
And I should have introduced Eric more fully. Our group knows him well. Eric has been a Schlesinger professor at the Miller Center and is a practitioner fellow here. He served as a career foreign service officer under both Democratic and Republican presidents, ambassador to Finland next to Russia, and ambassador to Turkey, very much a neighbor and now a complicated player in both conflicts, and final posting as Undersecretary of Defense in the Bush 43 administration. Sorry, Eric, back over to you.
No, I was just going to say I couldn't be happier to be in the same lineup with colleagues like Mara and Steve. Steve, with whom I worked over many of my 30 years in the Foreign Service, and Mara, who is now a really treasured colleague on the National Defense Strategy Commission that she and I are working on. And some of what I will say builds off of what Mara was talking about in her comments. And I suspect both she and I are still operating a little bit under the impact of some pretty bracing briefings we got yesterday afternoon in the Pentagon. So let me, Bill, I'll try to address your questions about the inevitable challenges of managing alliances between the fears of abandonment that allies have and the fears of entrapment that the U.S. has of being sucked into wars that its allies are going to get it into, which is very much a part of both conflicts here. But I really want to take a moment to just underscore, first of all, the gravity of the moment we're in, because I think we are on the cusp of a global conflict. Secondly, I think important for Americans to understand that U.S. military forces are already implicated in the conflicts that are unfolding, both because of the role we play supplying and advising Ukraine and the potential for attacks to spill over from Russia into NATO territory. We've already seen that with some air defense missiles Ukraine fired falling into Polish territory. Steve knows that story well, but also because of the role U.S. military forces are playing both in the Middle East and in the Indo-Pacific, which I'll get back to in a second. But just for reference, the USS Carney, Arleigh Burke class guided missile destroyer, had a 9-hour engagement with Houthi rebels in Yemen, firing cruise missiles and drones at Israel. U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria have been under persistent attack every day for the last 2 weeks, leading to casualties, minor casualties, but casualties nonetheless. We have 2 carrier task groups in the region, and so how this all plays out is hugely important and very consequential for the United States. I want to pick up on something Mara said when she talked about the president's speech 2 weeks ago, in which he linked the conflicts together. And Mara rightly said, this is a global conflict, but let me for a moment try and be even a little more specific about the nature of the links and how they are interrelated. You know, we have seen just in the past few weeks trains from the Democratic Republic of Korea, North Korea, traversing Eurasia to Russia to supply Russia with ammunition to continue its war in Ukraine. We've seen, to Steve's point, that Iran, which is both a major sponsor of Hamas and of the Houthis in Yemen, also providing Russia with drones that have been essential for the ability of Russia to continue its assault on Ukraine, its unprovoked aggression against Ukraine. And all of this, to Mara's point, is being funded essentially by the People's Republic of China, which is buying both Russian and Iranian oil, essentially at knockdown prices to benefit the ruling elite's economic performance, which has been suffering in China. At the same time that it's Coast Guard and maritime militia are ramming vessels of the Philippines, a U.S. treaty ally at Second Thomas Shoal. So the linkages here and the ability of this to be in very short order a global conflict, I think are very, very real. And I think we have a mental image of global conflict that is sort of World War III. It's sort of Slim Pickens, riding down at the end of Dr. Strangelove on a hydrogen bomb onto Soviet territory. But I don't think that's quite what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with something slightly different. It's what Minna Olander, a young Finnish international relations scholar, has characterized as sort of a global conflict with regional characteristics. And I think that is sort of what we're facing. And we're very ill-suited to face that. Bill, you started out by talking about the traditional post-Cold War planning concept for American defense, which was our ability to wage two major contingency operations, two MCOs, two major regional conflicts, MRCs, one in the Middle East and one in East Asia. And those were basically a war against Iraq and a war against North Korea. That was really what we used to measure our ability to fight. It's been a long time since we were actually capable of doing that, if we were ever capable of doing that. Bill, I served with Secretary of Defense Bill Perry from the Clinton administration on a defense panel 10 years ago, and he confessed that even though that was the war planning construct we had at the time in the 1990s, we were never really capable of actually doing that. And today, we're less capable of doing it than we were then, because for the last two presidencies, we've had a national defense strategy that says we're only going to really fight one conflict at a time. And yet we now find ourselves facing potentially conflicts in three theaters. Luckily, as Mara said, we have allies, which is very important, but it's going to be very, very difficult to manage both support for allies in Europe, our allies in the Middle East, as well as our allies in East Asia, if we've got conflict going in all three theaters at once, in part because our defense industrial base has shrunk enormously since the end of the Cold War. And we lack the ability as a nation to mobilize rapidly to allow ourselves to function as what President Biden correctly, in my view, said we should be, the arsenal of democracy in the face of this global conflict. The administration, Bill, to your point, I think has tried to embrace Israel in order to restrain it. I mean, one thing about alliances is, they're aggregations of military capability. They're also pacts of restraint. We signed our bilateral treaties with the Republic of Korea after the Korean War, in part because we wanted to deter North Korea, but also in part because we wanted to restrain Syngman Rhee. We signed our treaty with the Republic of China, Taiwan, after the first Taiwan Straits crisis in 1955. In part because we wanted to restrain Chiang Kai-shek and keep him from provoking the PRC. So alliances, function in both ways. And I think President Biden has wisely understood that, as Mara said, the events of October 7th in Israel have been a huge shock to the system in Israel. It does represent a existential threat to Israel. Has enormous overtones given the Holocaust that hit the Israeli psyche. And I think the president understood that the ability to restrain Israel and to try and hold Israel to abide by the law of armed conflict, as Mara said, was in part dependent on the Israeli understanding that the United States is supporting Israel's right to exist and has Israel's back in the largest way. I think the administration has worked very hard to contain the conflict and keep it from metastasizing and escalating. And today, Hassan Nasrallah is going to give a speech in Beirut. We don't know exactly what he's going to say, but it'll be very important because it may give us some indication of which direction Tehran and Hezbollah are leaning when it comes to the potential for escalation here. Because Israel could very soon find itself fighting a war on potentially 6 fronts. I mean, we've already got the front in Gaza with Israeli troops fighting even overnight. The Golani Brigade apparently fighting a very tough firefight with Hamas fighters. We've got what I mentioned earlier, the ongoing firing from Yemen, which has said it's a belligerent in this war. The Houthis have said they're a belligerent in the war. And we're not the only ones, by the way, who shot down missiles. The Saudis have intercepted missiles headed for Israel as well. But also potential for a front with Hezbollah in Lebanon, with the Shia militias in Syria. There's a whole panoply of them there. On the West Bank, and potentially with Iran directly, because if all these fronts explode, I have no doubt that Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Israeli War Cabinet will carry the war directly to Iran. So the potential here for escalation is great. One thing I would say, one criticism I have of the Biden administration's posture here is, to me, it is, in terms of deterrent messaging, been much too placating in tone, sort of begging Iran not to escalate. And in fact, I think the point here of deterrent messaging is to raise doubt in the minds of decision makers in Tehran about whether their regime, which is already facing enormous popular discontent, can survive a decision to go to war, and whether they will come out of this, in one piece. To me, that is the risk that leaves something to chance that Thomas Schelling talked about when he wrote about deterrence, that will most powerfully affect calculations in Tehran. Let me finish on 2 points, or 3 quick ones. One is on the law of armed conflict, to Mara's very well taken point. It's important to point out the law of armed conflict applies to both sides in any conflict, not just one. And Hamas is, essentially acting as a de facto state, and it is therefore bound as well. And the law of armed conflict makes it very clear that putting weapon systems and hiding them amongst civilians, military infrastructure, command and control operations, things that, as a result of, as Mara pointed out, military necessity, become targets in a war. It is the responsibility of that power for the civilian casualties that result. And I think it's very important to remember law of armed conflict applies to both sides, not just one side. Lest I appear to be somewhat hyperbolic in my remarks about global conflict, I want to repair to a higher authority, Bob Gates, my former boss, former Secretary of Defense, who has written that we are in the most perilous moment since the end of World War II. I think George Will had a column suggesting the same thing in the Washington Post yesterday. I agree with that. And I think we need to be honest with the American people about that. But to Secretary Gates's article, our dysfunctional government is impeding our ability to respond. And that is a huge challenge that we face. My final point, and I'll get off the stage, to Steve's point about the shocking results of polling about the response to Hamas's barbaric attacks, on Israel. My own view is that is a scathing verdict on the professoriate nationally in our country. And this is something that I address with my colleague Elliot Cohen and Shield of the Republic, the podcast co-sponsored by the Bulwark and the Miller Center, which we'll be posting today. So I will not comment further, but I invite people to listen to that podcast on that subject.
Eric, thank you. What I'd like to do is broaden the conversation to the East Asian dimension, given, Eric, the your broad comments and also Secretary Gates' comment about the global nature of it by bringing in both Harry Harding and Shirley Lin, who are with us today from Taiwan, and Ann Kokas. What is the view from East Asia? How do these connect? And then after that, we'll circle back around to the U.S. dimensions of the conflict, including how this lines up in the American political system, which Eric also referenced. So Harry and Shirley, thank you for joining us at 9:37 p.m. Your time. Please give us your sense of how all this looks from Taiwan, both literally and figuratively, given the fear of China doing something vis-a-vis Taiwan that people have been watching for many years. Russia's invasion of Ukraine raised it, and now we have a third conflict that another conflict that potentially makes that conflict even more worrisome.
Well, thank you very much, Bill, and hello, everyone. Good evening from Taiwan. Good morning to all of you on the East Coast. I think that we've already identified some of the concerns that especially are evident here in Taiwan and probably shared by many others in East Asia as well. And that is the question of whether the United States is really prepared to handle crises in three different parts of the world at the same time that are both separate and interconnected. And I think that that's the main concern here in Taiwan at the moment. I don't think that there's a widely perceived imminent threat from Beijing. That's something that could happen later down the road when conditions are basically so dire from China's point of view that it feels the need to attack Taiwan. I don't think it feels that need right now, but there is a concern that if the worst were to happen, would the United States and its allies all be prepared to provide the help that Taiwan would hope for and indeed would expect? And that question of expectation leads to something that's already been brought up by Eric, and I'm glad he raised it. There is an awareness that whether it's a formal alliance or simply a less formal, more informal, but still very important set of defense commitments, that these involve a difficult combination of support and constraint. That's a very, very major part of the history of U.S.-Taiwan relations. That's a course that I'm teaching in Taiwan right now, a course that I've never taught before. And I'm finding it absolutely fascinating to learn more about that history, because that has been a major theme in the U.S.-Taiwan relationship, that the United States has periodically seen Taiwan as a troublemaker that needed to be constrained. The most dramatic case was when the United States, through very successful intelligence, was able to undermine a quite secretive Taiwanese attempt to develop nuclear weapons in the 1970s and 80s. And the United States felt that that was important to enforce the non-proliferation regime, which it was, that it would not have significantly increased Taiwan's defensive capability, or maybe even its deterrence capability against mainland China, which may have been also true. And the Taiwanese felt it was absolutely essential to their defense and their deterrence because China had just developed its own nuclear weapons. So what we saw as totally responsible, reasonable, upholding the norms of non-proliferation, the Taiwanese felt as disappointment at best and betrayal at worst. So this is a theme in the relationship that goes on for several decades, and the Taiwanese are quite concerned now that the United States is going to be either militarily too overextended to be able to provide the support to Taiwan that the Taiwanese have come to hope for and expect, and or that the support for Taiwan by American allies and by the American public is going to begin to wane as the costs and risks of the conflict with China begin to increase. So I think that that's how I see things in Taiwan. It's a renewed sense of concern, possible disappointment, possible even worse than that. And see if Shirley wants to have a different perspective about either Taiwan or about the rest of the region.
I'll just supplement what Harry says from here, which is, I think since February 24th, of course, everyone on the island is very concerned about whether Taiwan could defend itself. And it's, of course, very important for U.S. policy as well. How much does the U.S. have to actually intervene in the Taiwan Strait? But since October 7th, something, of course, new has happened, and it's a very big struggle, if you will, for those people who are here on the island, and that is U.S. skepticism towards U.S. commitment is rising, but second, at the same time, it's very concerned about what happened in Israel with Hamas surprise attack, because that is what people are expecting here every day from China. That suddenly you wake up and there's a concert and people have been slaughtered. So there's a lot of every day the front page news is about how that could happen here. But surprisingly, of course, on the cultural front, Taiwan is both economically and culturally, Taiwan is very tied to its biggest enemy, China. So very interestingly, all of the media is about how sympathetic, actually, I wouldn't say China would like to be painted as China being sympathetic, but China in the Chinese-speaking world have shown really the humanitarian disaster in Gaza every day on TV, in Chinese writing and press. I would say it's 80% to 20%. 80% very sympathetic to Palestinians, painting really whataboutism about the U.S., not really understanding being balanced, providing constraint, but fueling the conflict. And this is very interesting because Taiwan is both Israel and Palestine, and Taiwan's both Ukraine, in the sense that Russia is just as big as China is in terms of a threat, and at the same time, it has these two dynamic going on. And the reason this is very important is Taiwan will have a new president in January 2024, and the Chinese are very concerned, are intervening in the election actively, and if it is not pleased with what's going on, that it will actually do more than what we see here. Although the Chinese economy and technology-wise, there's a lot going on that you have all learned that it's doing very poorly. And I know Anne will have a lot to say about that, but I think the Chinese domestic issues economically and politically are giving some people hope that it will not be able to intervene in the Middle East and in the Taiwan Strait as much as it had hoped just say a few months ago. But I'd love to hear what Anne thinks.
Perfect, because I was going to pull Anne into this. Anne is the Yen professor at the Miller Center and is a professor of media studies here at UVA in the College of Arts and Sciences. So, Anne, give us your wisdom, including since we were going through this period of whether it's decoupling or de-risking, where the U.S. engagement with China seems to be on the way, or at least U.S. integration with China seems to be on the wane. The engagement seems to be about expressing concern as opposed to focusing on cooperation. How does this all play out?
Yeah, so I think just picking up on Shirley's thread regarding the tech landscape, one thing that I think we can see, particularly as it relates to China's involvement, is how China's expansive growth in the tech sector, both domestically and globally, has actually started to bear fruit in terms of ways that China can become very cheaply involved in this conflict without actually having to put boots on the ground or work militarily. So in the context of China's domestic politics, we see that on Baidu and Alibaba's AMAP, the state of Israel no longer exists. It has been wiped off of those mapping platforms. So this is a way to kind of assert a political position through Chinese tech platforms without actually having to become involved in the conflict more explicitly. We can also see, building on Steve's point, the way in which China's involvement on digital platforms also allows the potential to sow division within U.S. domestic conflicts, particularly if we look at Gen Z and these divisions in terms of how people in that generation perceive questions of Israel and Palestine. This is building on a long-term playbook that was actually refined in the context of Taiwan, of identifying pre-existing domestic divisions and then enhancing them through social media platforms. So in this way, it's possible for China to actually undermine a lot of U.S. positions in both of these conflicts, while also not actually becoming involved on a more explicit level. Now, when we think about U.S. engagement with China versus these questions of de-risking, I think one of the big challenges that I see as someone whose interests focuses on U.S.-China relations is the more that the U.S. becomes involved in these conflicts, the less it's actually able to attend to building constructive relations with China, or finding potential areas of agreement to move forward on important issues like AI and climate change, where these are kind of all hands on deck, long-term chronic issues. And so, looking at it from the U.S.-China relations perspective, one of my central concerns here is how these acute conflicts are actually also detracting from the chronic issues that we see that are, global challenges that the U.S. and China will have to address together. So I'm eager to hear more about what others have to say, but I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anne. I'd like to pull in Governor and Ambassador Gilmore. Jim Gilmore served as governor here in Virginia, and then recently was the U.S. ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe during the Trump administration. So, Governor Gilmore, thank you for joining us. You're interested in all the dimensions of this, not just the geopolitical, but also the U.S. domestic political dimensions. As we heard, that itself contributes the uncertainty and divisions in our own country are contributing to a sense of uncertainty internationally about what the U.S. may or may not do in supporting both Israel and Ukraine. We'd love your thoughts.
Well, I'm here in the posture of a listener to these extraordinary policymakers and thinkers that are on the presentation this morning, and I think I've already learned a lot. And one thing I've learned is that the situation is even more serious and dire than I thought it was. And I've been a spokesman out there about trying to raise the alarm here domestically in the United States to try to join the American people together. I've been a spokesman particularly on the Ukraine war. But frankly, the message I'm getting from the presenters this morning is the seriousness of the conflict, particularly the idea of the linkage, and whether or not there's some big conspiracy of people sitting down and talking together, which, by the way, all evidence shows that maybe they are. Whether they are or not, the consequences of what's going on are dire, I think, is what I get out of the presentations that have been presented so far this morning. I have often thought and have said that the Ukraine war is the strong point, is the central point. That Europe is the friendliness and warmth of Europe's politics towards the United States and the alliances that are in Europe are existentially important to the United States. If Europe becomes neutralized or less friendly, then at that point the U.S. is in danger. And at that point, the Pacific issue would probably begin to emerge. What I'm hearing on the presentations this morning is that it's already linked and already in play globally. I happen to agree with the position that we're on the cusp of a global conflict. And I noticed the difference between the perception of the American people on this, the difference between that perception and what the reality is that's been presented by the experts this morning. I am very concerned as a lifelong conservative Republican about the rise of isolationism in my party and have been a spokesman against it and am trying to make people realize the danger of this. The history in World War II and parallel to what is going on today is precise. I was just reading last night, as a matter of fact, about Charles Lindbergh and the position that he was taking prior to World War II. We'll recall that we never really got into World War II. We let the European thing go a long, long way before we ever got into World War II. We never did get into it until Pearl Harbor. The U.S. has a long history of ignoring these things and dwelling within ourselves. And at this point, domestic politics are serious. The divisions are serious. The politics is quite polarized. And I think we need to have a reemergence of a common theme of American values and American leadership, and together with our allies. I wrote down when I was listening a few minutes ago to the question, I asked myself the question, can we in fact develop a strategy, a United States strategy, to deal with all of these conflicts simultaneously? Because it would appear to me that anti-American adversaries, if they're sitting down either together or separately, can say, well, we may be able to press these people, the Americans, and their friends at this moment in time, in which case we are in a global conflict. The question is, can we develop a strategy? And I wrote down, being the internal optimist, I said, yes, we can develop a strategy, but we have to do it with our allies. But the good news is that today, my experience is our allies are with us. And the people of the world, among the populations among our allies, are with us. And I believe actually that there are people in the populations of our adversaries who are with us because of American values and because of our dedication to liberty. That's pretty Jeffersonian, I guess, but that's a good theme for this organization. But it looks to me like we're going to have to get about that business, and we're going to have decisive leadership at the national level to confront this challenge. And I'm really happy to be able to listen to these experts here at the Miller Center, who I think are sounding the alarm. And I think now it's incumbent on all of us to begin to look ahead to the potential conflict and to what strategic efforts have to be made on our part to meet it.
Thank you, Governor Gilmore. So well stated. We have about 7 minutes till 10, but many of our group can extend for another 15 minutes past 10 o'clock. We will lose a few people. Governor Gilmore, you talked about the role of democracies, and we've got a few questions from the audience. Please keep them coming. I'm going to cluster them and direct them at several of our other panelists here. One question is, although the U.S. has been the world leader among democracies, should we be concerned about overextending our financial and military support to these conflicts in light of our annual budget deficits and national debt? But the flip side is, how does any democratic government negotiate with Hamas or any other terrorist group if they've made it clear their mission is to kill Jews? And so with that, I'll call in Phil Potter, John Owen, Chuck Matthews, and Spencer Bakich, and have each of you reflect, if you could, for a minute or two, a couple minutes on the dilemmas for democracies, how we continue to both pay for these things militarily, but also project democratic values around the world. Phil, let me start with you, particularly on the military side. You're an expert both at the politics department and the DeBatten School. You run a center on security policy. How do you think about that? Those twin democratic issues, and then after that, I'll turn to John, Chuck, and Spencer.
Yeah, no, this is a great conversation, and that's a great question. I think what I have to say about it will echo a lot of what we've already heard. The short version of this is, from a military standpoint, we're really capable, right? And that to me is sort of an important point to put in. We've got what we need in order to sort of hold these things in place, although I do not want to understate the extent to which the situation is precarious. And what I mean by that is that for us, three fronts at once has always been a problem. That's not something we've been equipped to do. We've talked at various points about how challenging 2 fronts would be. Certainly 3 has only at a very few points in time been aspirationally even possible. And so, to me, I think that this comes down to a problem of trying to diagnose exactly what is so dangerous about this moment, right? What's actually going on here. And I think there's a temptation sometimes to overdraw the connectivity between these incidents that are occurring around the globe and saying, hey, maybe there's some coordination going on here. Maybe there's, everyone's looking at the United States and saying we're in decline. I don't think that's quite the right way to think about it. Our capabilities are what they were. There's nothing that's fundamentally changed there. I think the right way to think about this is that when you are maintaining a global order, a mature global order, in the early stages, the nice way to think about that is that you're making, everybody's a little bit better off, or key players are a little bit better off than they might otherwise be. In the late stages, frankly, it becomes a collective action problem, right? And so, no, we can't hold everybody in place all at once, but dealing with several of them at once is going to be a real problem. That the challenge for the adversary is who goes first. And so what I think we're looking at here and what makes this so dangerous is an erosion of that collective action problem, increasingly due to coincidence or opportunism or whatever it might be. Problems are starting to kind of queue up in the system and really threaten our ability to hold it all in place with the capabilities we have. And so that then requires a very sort of clear-eyed realism about what it is we are trying to maintain, which is frankly this global order, and what it takes to do it. And, sadly, and I think this goes to why this is all so dangerous, that's exactly the kind of thing that democracies are terrible at, right? It's a little bit too big to happen completely behind the scenes where the American people are not engaged with it. It's a little bit too small and too theoretical to get domestic publics totally animated the way they become in a wartime scenario. And so it's in that sort of dead space that democracies don't thrive in when it comes to foreign policy. And so, to me, the capability that we really need to generate is domestic political capability. It has nothing to do with the military stuff, which I think we essentially have as much as we're going to have, and I think is sufficient to the task.
John Owen, you've written about, John's a professor in our politics department, a Miller Center fellow. You've written about global order. At a moment when we've got now two shocks to the system, does it feel like the democratic order is fraying? Or I've heard some people say President Biden has done more, and not to mention Putin's invasion of Ukraine has done more to restore democracies collaborating to hold up the democratic order than has happened in the last 15 years.
Yeah, that's a huge, very important question. Let me open. I'll be brief, but I want to open by raising an objection that's been alluded to here in this terrific discussion. An objection that comes from particularly younger Americans, but people around the world, young and old, that this is really what connects these two wars is they're about pushing back against American power. This plays out in the Russia story. This is mostly on the populist right, but there are elements on the far left that believe this too, that Russia is simply defending itself against American hegemony, extensions of American power in that region. NATO is a U.S.-led alliance, et cetera, et cetera. In the Middle East, Israel is regarded as not just a colonial enterprise, but a colonial enterprise of the West, meaning the United States. And so Hamas is pushing back really against American power. And if Iran's behind this, they're doing the same thing. So a lot of people believe this, and this is what they see. So they think all that's been said so far misses the fundamental point of what's going on. So I want to acknowledge that power is at stake. And I think we need to say, yeah, the United States is the world's only superpower. So there's an element of that at work, but that is woefully inadequate. It does not exhaust what's going on. Democracy, both within countries and the democratic order, is at stake in these conflicts. The United States, so democracy and American power, like it or not, are entangled. The United States wants to keep its democracy. It does better as a powerful democracy when there's more democracy out there in the world, when the international institutions are liberal, when there are democracies, there are more rather than fewer democracies. So yes, it's about power, but yes, it's also about democracy, and you cannot pry these things apart. You can do it analytically, but in practice, they're linked. So what's going on now is I do think the democratic order, both within this country and internationally, is fraying. And I think probably coincidentally, Tehran, Moscow, and Beijing's a special case, but sensing a moment of weakness. Note that Russia didn't just start this war to bargain with Ukraine. It was trying to destroy Ukraine. Hamas, I think it's fair to say, is trying to destroy Israel, at least bring about the first step in the destruction of Israel. So these are serious, high-stakes conflicts. So all of that said, there is hope, and I do think the Biden administration has done, on the whole, what it needs to do to show support, while, as Eric says, counseling restraint in the right places in the right times. So, but the larger picture is, I think this is a global struggle. It doesn't mean World War III, but it does mean things are lining up. One last thing on China, and I know I'm not the China expert in the room. My sense is China is willing to exploit some of this, but also is not so comfortable with total disorder either in Eastern Europe or in the Middle East. I think China wants a more orderly world that it can step up and do more management of than it has. So this is not a united authoritarian foe where a few people are sitting in the room together spinning out scenarios. But I do think they have a common interest, and I think we're seeing that playing out. Yeah, so I'll stop. I'll rattle on long enough, but I'll stop there. Thank you.
John, you walked up to the line, but didn't go there, of an axis of evil. And and I think it's a really interesting phrase in this regard, because there does appear to be an axis of, say, chaos that enjoys a little bit of a dislodging of the U.S.-led world order. And I now want to turn that question back to Chuck and to Spencer. You're both experts on the rules and ethics and morality at some level of war. And I would love for you to talk about that. Chuck is a professor in the Religious Studies department and has written extensively about these topics. So Chuck, why don't we start with you, and then I'll turn to Spencer, who's a Miller Center fellow, as well as being a professor at VMI down the road.
Yeah, happy to be here. This is such a wonderful conversation. I do tend to not work at the bleeding edge of current events, but at longer term issues. And I wanted to go back to what Eric had said, and also Steve Mull had said, about questions around whether or not people are thinking about whether or not violence can be used ethically. And that goes back to this question of the rules of war. And just to point out a kind of paradox and maybe a little irony of our situation, the rules of war are part of a kind of broader collection of rough guidances about how rough equals can deal with each other. That's the idea, that in some sense there's got to be structures of equality. And the U.S. has been very good about instituting a kind of, as we say, a liberal world order. The complicating fact about that is that the liberal world order, given U.S. hegemony, is so asymmetrically tilted towards the U.S., and in this conflict, ironically, tilted towards Israel, that the asymmetry of power sometimes can make it hard for people to appreciate the idea that rules are actually being applied equally across these asymmetries. So there's an interesting puzzle, I think, in the deepest levels around why so many people are cynical, I would say, about the possibility of rules when they see such asymmetries of power between the U.S. and everybody else, or Israel and Hamas in Gaza. And that's why I think we see a lot of those questions, not just now, but in years in the past. So I think one of the things that people like I have to do is underscore again and again that these rules really ought to bind even the strong. And the difficulty I think we're facing right now is that not so much about people complaining that Israel is not following the rules, so much as them complaining that the rules are a sham. And I think as Eric said, and as Steve said, this is extremely dangerous. We've seen a couple of these statements in American intellectual circles, some of my professorial colleagues who don't seem to want to differentiate between the killing of civilians intentionally and the killing of civilians, being very frank about it, that is a unforced, unpredicted, or unanticipated or unintended consequence of a military strike. Now, I'm not denying that real horror happens here, but just that distinction, which is maybe ethically a little uncertain for us if you're on the receiving end of this stuff, could be very important in the long run, because it also allows for critiques to be launched in both directions. So if you don't want to say that the Hamas attack on the Israeli settlements was an ethical abhorrence, it's very hard to see why you would be upset about large-scale bombing of an indiscriminate bombing of cities. It doesn't seem like you have the ethical standards there to apply. And that would be my question, is in some ways for us, not a question for us, but to think about as we go on, the difficulty of applying these rules in a situation where asymmetries of power are so marked, and the difficulty of having people believe in them when the situation of power is so asymmetrical. That's all. Thank you.
Spencer, Chuck made that very important distinction between intentionally targeting civilians and collateral damage, which is such an antiseptic phrase. It doesn't take away the horror of seeing innocents die. And yet it is so central to the rules of war, particularly in a conflict, as somebody else noted, where Hamas is using civilians as shields. And we've seen civilian shields going back at least 25 years to when I was in government in Bosnia, where that became a central part of what Serbs were doing as part of ethnic cleansing. They were both targeting civilians and then also using civilians as shield. So tell us, particularly since in addition to your Miller Center being a senior fellow with us, you actually teach in a school, you teach international relations in a school that whose students are cadets. How do you teach and reinforce that? And if the world at large doesn't see the distinction, how does that present itself to rising corps of officers?
So thank you for asking a very simple question, and one that's relatively easy to answer. The difficulties are enormous, and you can see in pretty much every single decision that the administration and our allies and partners have had to make. Precisely those challenges. I mean, you can go back to the discussion as to whether or not the Biden administration was acting ethically in providing cluster munitions to the Ukrainians. You can talk about the difficulties that the Israelis are going to face and are facing in trying to give fair warning to civilians that particular targets will be hit. What Eric and his colleague Elliot Cohen talked about a couple of episodes ago in Shield of the Republic, roof knocking is the term that's been used. To be honest with you, Bill, I of course don't have any firm answers to this question. I'm neither a lawyer nor a philosopher. The only thing that I can offer my cadets is give them the opportunity to reason ethically, to try to instill in their thinking how it is that we can go about being very concerned with vital questions of combat effectiveness, but also holding to high standards of moral conduct. And in some ways, it is situational ethics. In others, there are broad principles that we have to think through. If I could say just one thing really quickly, we've spoken extensively about the nitty-gritty details about American national security policy and the interconnectedness of our world challenges today, global challenges today. One of the things that I would commend to everyone on this panel and everyone listening is to pick up the most recent edition of issue of Foreign Affairs. The National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, has a fascinating piece on American grand strategy. And the most fascinating thing about that article is that it is late because it doesn't include the most recent war in Gaza. If we're interested in understanding the broader framework for how the administration goes about fashioning various components of a broader national security policy, I think a good place to start is with Jake Sullivan's comments and his attempting to lay out a broad framework. There are a couple of points that I would make, and I think first and foremost is that the administration seems to be thinking in terms of certainly, as Phil said, supporting a mature global order, but democracy support is, I think, one of the key ways of thinking about how the administration is approaching this. Not democracy promotion, but holding the line in regions where democracies are under threat. There are a lot of different components that we could go into, but I think it's important to know that I think the administration is struggling mightily in trying to fashion a broader grand strategy in a time of complexity and global flux. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Spencer. I'm going to call on Eric Edelman to help bring us home, and then if there are other closing remarks, and if not, I'll do the final words here.
Bill, I just wanted to respond very briefly to what Chuck and Spencer, have talked about very eloquently in terms of sort of how to think about the ethics of this and the imbalance of power. And Chuck made the point that sometimes it appears that the rules are not binding on the more powerful, and certainly we have various sins to answer for in the U.S. government on that from time to time. But I would stress that in the current situation in Israel, I think it's incumbent on those of us who are trying to talk about how Israel is attempting to abide by the law of armed conflict, how it binds Hamas as well as Israel, to also point out that Israeli ministers, some of the ministers of the government, have engaged in absolutely unacceptable, outrageous eliminationist rhetoric, suggesting that all of Gaza should be carpet bombed and turned into beach condos, and that the current Israeli government, at least in its initial incarnation before its expansion after the 7th of October, has encouraged all kinds of outrages by settlers on the West Bank, which have also implicated IDF troops who have been caught videoing some of these settler outrages. But to its credit, the IDF is investigating and trying to bring those soldiers to account. I think all those are important points.
Thank you, Eric. I see Governor Gilmore to bring comments in, and we have one other participant, Yuri Urbanovich, who I'd love to also bring in before we close. Governor Gilmore.
Well, very quickly, my reaction to this is to remind myself that everything that we've talked about today is about politics. War is an instrument of politics. Messaging is an instrument of politics, and I want to underscore the essential importance of messaging. The telling the story of what we're trying to achieve and why we're trying to achieve it has to be persuasive. That, I think, has been addressed by several people here today, that maybe we're not really focusing on that enough, that what we're trying to accomplish is the right thing, and we have to explain why it's the right thing and meet the objections of other people in the global South and otherwise who are responding to the counter message that, well, it's NATO's fault, or the United States is hegemonic, or the Israelis are doing the wrong thing to defend themselves. These are all political messages, and we have to develop our own message and our own sense of what we think is right and why we think it's right, because the message in politics is usually everything. Thanks.
Thank you, Governor Gilmore. Yuri Urbanovich, Yuri, who's an associate professor here at UVA in the politics department, who's taught courses on U.S.-Russia relations over the years. Yuri, we've had this big conversation. You've been part of our conversation for a year and a half. It's now circled the globe in its focus. Give us the view from where you sit and how you watch this, particularly since we've all been trying to think about where the war in Ukraine goes. Given another conflict, does it complicate things? Does it make it harder in Ukraine and Russia to see how that conflict gets resolved? Give us your take, and then we'll bring it to a close.
Thank you very much, Bill. Very interesting discussion, conversation. I think we need to have even more of these kind of discussions. From my point of view, these two conflicts are very different. on one hand, we have Palestinians and Israelis who belong, I would say, to a certain degree to different civilizations even. As far as Russia-Ukraine conflict is concerned, I disagree with John Owen's statement that Russia wants to destroy simply Ukraine. For Russia, it is a question of identity, because, most of Russians consider Ukraine as part of, Russian world, what they call. Kiev, for the Russians, is the northern Jerusalem. And for them to see northern Jerusalem under the control of NATO, for example, is totally unacceptable. So this is why their ultimate goal is to make Ukraine part of Russia. This is the idea. And of course, this is what complicates this conflict. And my main concern, and my heart is bleeding, when I see this, my prediction is that Ukrainians are losing, this conflict. Okay, I have different, sources about the number of Ukrainians who already lost their lives, from 100,000 to 400,000. And of course, my question, as it was long ago, I will repeat it again, are we planning to fight against Russia until the last Ukrainian? This is the problem. And most recent publications by, commander of Ukrainian forces supports my, I would say, argument that Ukrainians simply are running out of their people. And of course, it's a tragedy. And, one of most recent publications suggests, that Russians established even a military unit of those Ukrainians who surrendered to the Russians. It is called, Bogdan Khmelnytsky regiment, which will be fighting, on the Russian side. Plus, what I also want to emphasize, and I raised this question many times, we forget that Russia is a nuclear superpower, And if escalation, reaches unpredictable dimension, it might end up with, nuclear Armageddon. And most recent, decisions of the Russian parliament to withdraw, their ratification of global treaty banning nuclear weapons, is an indication of that. Again, I repeat, Russia cannot lose, this conflict in Ukraine. And if it comes, to the existential, I would say, threat, they will use, nuclear weapons. So this is what is very disturbing for me. And I would like to, discuss this question more, in the future, because it is very, very dangerous, tendency. And unfortunately, as far as a majority, of Russian population is concerned, they support, Putin in his war in Ukraine. This is what actually happened, particularly, in the last few months. Originally, many, Russians, including Russian intelligentsia, first of all, were very much against, this war. But currently, it is considered as an existential war between Russia and the West. And Ukraine is only an instrument. This is how it is interpreted, in Russian propaganda, if you wish. Thank you.
Well, Yuri, thank you. If I can bring it to a close with a few thoughts, particularly on that last point. So we started from a very much a U.S. perspective of two conflicts that the United States is a party to in providing material support and in some ways broader military assurances. And yet we are not a conflict in that our own troops are not dying, though we certainly have U.S. citizens, certainly in Israel and perhaps even in Ukraine, who are at risk. I am struck by the fact that over the last 35 years, going back, 50 years, going back to Vietnam, across the conflicts in the Middle East that we were involved in after 9/11, where we were putting our own soldiers at risk, Right now, we have two conflicts where people are looking to us for support. And even with respect to Yuri's concern about how much the Ukrainians are running out of people to fight this war, in both cases, you're having enormous civilians becoming combatants, turning themselves into soldiers in both places. I think as these conflicts go forward, to me, and we look back at conflicts over the last 50 or 75 years since World War II, that becomes the vital question. How much are both countries willing to fight for their own freedom? It becomes a question in Taiwan. If a conflict breaks out there, how much do the Taiwanese declare their independence? And so as I look at these conflicts and we think about American political support, that to me is the critical barometer. As long as these countries continue to fight for their own freedom as a democracy, what are our obligations to support them? And so with that, I want to thank all of our panelists for this incredibly rich and more than stimulating educational opportunity. I know we will want to do these kinds of conversations again in the future as these two conflicts unfold. And thanks to our audience for terrific questions and terrific engagement. We look forward to seeing you soon.